Elias Voss had been offered a great many things over the years in exchange for doing terrible work: money, ships, land, the coordinates of places the Empire didn't want anyone to know existed. He had been offered loyalty oaths from warlords, gratitude from governors, the tearful thanks of people he'd quietly bled dry of every resource they'd spent their lives accumulating, and he had taken most of it, all of it, without flinching, because flinching was a luxury that didn't survive long in his particular line of work. He sat now in a private booth aboard the Coronal, the most expensive orbital station in the frontier reach, and looked across a table at three men who all had the particular, careful bearing of people who'd spent a lifetime giving orders to other people's violence rather than conducting it themselves. Coalition representatives, their identification seals read, 3 frontier worlds banding together behind a single shared interest. "You come highly recommended," the one in the center said. His name was Dresser. Gray-haired, polished, the kind of clean that only happened when someone else was doing your dirty work. 7 years of contracts. 38 completed. 0 failures on record. "I don't take contracts I can't complete," Elias said. "Keeps the record clean. This one is different. They're always different. Give me the specifics." Dresser set a data chip on the table between them, sliding it forward with one finger the way a man might offer something to an animal he wasn't entirely certain wouldn't bite him. "The Vulpine Kingdom. You know it?" Elias kept his face neutral. "Hidden system, outer drift. Fox folk. Nobody's confirmed the location in about 40 years. But the rumor mill puts it somewhere past the Kethera belt. We've confirmed the location," Dresser said. "At considerable expense. And the job?" The 3 men exchanged a look that carried the weight of a decision already made and a conscience already quieted. "The Queen," Dresser said. "Vela Salvain. She's been quiet for decades, kept her kingdom hidden, kept her people off the galactic stage entirely. Something's changed. We have intelligence suggesting she's moving to unite the remaining Vulpine clans. If she succeeds, the frontier worlds face an organized, militarized power directly on their resource trade routes." "You want her dead," Elias said. "We want the unification stopped," Dresser said, which was a different thing only in the way that powerful men always liked to believe it was different. "The Queen is the unification. Without her, the clans fracture. The threat dissolves." Elias picked up the data chip, turned it between his fingers. "What's the number?" Dresser told him. Elias set the chip back down. Picked it up again. Looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he's been looking for without knowing it for a long time. "When do I leave?" he said. He spent 2 weeks preparing the way he always did, methodically, without sentiment, gathering intelligence through channels that didn't officially exist and running contingencies until the plan was thin enough to move fast and strong enough to survive going wrong. He hired no crew. He never hired crew. Crew had families, crew had reasons, crew made decisions in the moment based on variables that weren't part of the original equation. Elias had learned, over 7 years of contracts nobody else would take, that the only reliable variable in any operation was himself. The Dusk Runner was his. Fully, legally, bought with money earned the same way all his money had been earned, through work that occupied the uncomfortable space between mercenary and assassin that most people preferred not to examine too closely. She was a small, fast courier-class ship that nobody looked at twice, which was the most valuable quality any transport in his line of work could possess. He spent the 2 weeks modifying her, adjusting the stealth plating, recalibrating the jump drive for a destination the navigational charts flagged as unoccupied empty space. The Coalition's intelligence on the Vulpine Kingdom's location turned out to be better than he'd expected, a navigational relay tucked behind a debris field, projecting a false space reading that would have fooled any automated scan and most human ones too. It hadn't fooled whatever method Dresser's people had used to find it, and it didn't fool the modifications Elias had made to the Duskrunner's sensor array. "Smart," he said to himself, sitting alone in the cockpit as the false space reading resolved into the navigational truth behind it, A star system hidden in plain sight, 3 inhabitable worlds orbiting a mild orange sun. Very smart. 40 years and nobody's found you. He sat with that a moment. 40 years of successfully hiding an entire people from a galaxy that would rather see them as a resource than a civilization. He sat with it, and then he let it go, because sitting with things had a way of becoming feeling things, and feeling things had a way of costing him contracts. He ran the approach calculation twice, picked the entry vector least likely to trigger whatever early warning system a 40-year-old hidden kingdom had inevitably built into its perimeter, and began his descent toward a world that had spent 40 years wanting nothing more than to be left alone. He was about to make that very difficult. The kingdom itself was not what he'd expected, though he couldn't have said precisely what he had expected. Something primitive, perhaps, the way people always pictured hidden civilizations they decided were better off staying hidden. What he found instead, surveying the surface through the Duskrunner's optics from a low-orbit holding position, was a society that had spent 40 years building inward rather than outward, developing the kind of dense, layered infrastructure that came from a people who decided that depth mattered more than expansion. The capital city rose from the forested lowlands of the second world like something grown rather than built, architecture that curved and wound between enormous trees, bridges spanning canyons of green, the whole thing lit with a warm amber light that seemed more like an extension of the landscape than an imposition on it. No military installations on the surface, or none visible from orbit, though he noted with professional appreciation the network of atmospheric defense platforms disguised as weather monitoring stations. Whoever had designed their security was thoughtful, patient, and very good. The palace was easy enough to identify, larger than the surrounding structures, set on a natural elevation that provided both defense and visibility, connected to the city below by a series of covered walkways. Easy to identify, considerably harder to approach, with elevation sight lines that made ground approaches obvious and air approaches even more so. "This isn't going to be simple," he told the empty cockpit, which agreed with him in the way that empty cockpits always did, silently and without useful suggestions. He spent 3 days in passive observation before committing to his insertion point. A dense forested approach on the palace's eastern face that his scans suggested was patrolled on a 68-minute rotation, long enough for a careful man to move considerably closer than anyone should be able to get to a royal residence without being invited. He'd made his career on careful. He was, perhaps, the single most careful man currently operating in the frontier reach, which was why the coalition had paid him an obscene amount of money to be here, and why he was going to do the job regardless of the lingering, unprofessional unease that had followed him down from orbit like a smell he couldn't quite locate the source of. He landed the Duskrunner in a clearing 8 kilometers east of the palace perimeter, set her to cold shutdown and active camouflage, and went in on foot with a pack that contained exactly what he needed and nothing sentimental. 7 years had taught him the particular discipline of traveling light. Weapons, tools, extraction gear, 3 days of rations, and no photographs of anyone he cared about, mostly because he'd spent 7 years carefully ensuring there was nobody he cared about enough to carry a photograph of. The forest between the landing site and the palace was older than anything he'd walked through in recent memory. Trees wide enough at the base that 2 men couldn't circle one with joined hands, the canopy high and cathedral-dim above, the air rich with something organic and green that his lungs registered as fundamentally unlike the recycled nothing of ships and stations he'd spent most of his life breathing. He moved through it slowly, respectfully, cataloging the patrol drones disguised as birds that circled the upper canopy at regular intervals with a professional interest that wasn't quite admiration but was close enough to trouble him slightly. He was within 2 kilometers of the palace's eastern wall when he heard voices. Not patrol voices, not the low, professional murmur of trained security moving through a rotation, but the particular quality of voices that don't expect to be overheard. He paused, calibrated, and shifted his approach 30 degrees south. 2 of them, moving fast. One voice he didn't recognize, Vulpine, female, edged with something urgent and tight. The other was wrong in a way it took him a moment to place, the wrongness arriving slowly, and then all at once when he finally cleared the tree enough to see the speakers. The second voice was Imperial. Not frontier colonial. Not fringe world militia. Imperial, as in the galactic government that had quietly, carefully been positioning assets along the frontier reach for the better part of 2 decades, the same empire that Dresser and his coalition colleagues were nominally trying to protect their trade routes from, the same empire that had somehow placed a handler on the edge of a hidden kingdom that nobody was supposed to know the location of. Elias went very still, cataloging exits, cataloging angles, and wondering, for the first time since he'd taken this contract, exactly who had sold him the intelligence that had led him here. He listened for 11 minutes, flat in the undergrowth, breathing slow and controlled, the way you only breathed when noise was the difference between alive and dead. The Imperial handler, a man, heavy-set, wearing clothes too expensive to belong in a forest, was giving instructions in the clipped, layered shorthand of someone who'd spent years talking around the things they were actually saying. The timeline moves tonight. The Coalition's man is already inside the system, which is precisely what we needed him to be. The Vulpine, female, young, the quality of her clothing marking her as court rather than common, too well-dressed for outdoor work, too nervous for professional loyalty, kept her voice low with visible effort. If the Queen dies, everything destabilizes. The clans won't unify, they'll fracture. The whole system goes dark. You told me the Empire wanted influence, not collapse. The Empire wants exactly what's useful, the handler said. A destabilized Vulpine Kingdom is useful for the next 4 years. A unified one is a problem for the next 40. We play long odds here. You used me to leak the kingdom's location to the Coalition. We use resources available to us, the handler said, which was a diplomat's way of confirming exactly what she'd accused him of. You'll be compensated. The arrangements we discussed will hold. And the mercenary? If he completes the contract, he'll take the fall for an assassination that advances Imperial interests, which is considerably cheaper than paying the actual cost of a covert operation, and considerably cleaner than having Imperial hands visible anywhere near a Vulpine political crisis. Elias Voss lay very still in the undergrowth and thought, with the particular clarity of a man whose professional situation has just become significantly more complicated, about the 38 completed contracts behind him, the clean record, the obscene fee he'd been promised, and the fact that someone had just told him, in plain hearing, that he'd been designed from the very start to be a disposable instrument in someone else's much larger plan. The handler left first, moving back through the trees toward whatever Imperial insertion point he'd used to get here. The Vulpine woman stayed behind, standing very still with her arms wrapped tight around herself and her face turned toward the palace's distant amber glow, and Elias watched the shape of her guilt from his hiding place in the undergrowth, and made a decision that he knew, even as he made it, was going to cost him the cleanest retirement he'd ever been offered. He let the handler go. He had a different problem now. He had his entry by nightfall, the eastern wall, the 68-minute patrol rotation, a drainage access point that the palace's architects had clearly considered too small for any serious threat, and that Elias had spent 3 days confirming was exactly the right size for a serious threat who'd spent 7 years learning to make himself small. He moved through it with the particular, disciplined economy of someone who'd done this specific kind of work more times than he found comfortable to count, and emerged inside the palace's service level into a corridor lit by amber panels that cast everything in that same warm, lived-in glow he noticed from orbit. The palace was quieter than he'd expected at this hour. Deep night, the rotations thin, most of the domestic staff long since retired to whatever quarters a royal household provided. He moved through service corridors and maintenance access points, following a schematic assembled from 3 days of passive orbital scanning and the institutional knowledge of several previous contractors who'd managed partial penetration of the perimeter but never gotten this far, navigating toward the residential wing where the Coalition's intelligence had placed the Queen's private chambers. He was 2 corridors from his destination when he heard the second thing that wasn't supposed to be there. Footsteps. Fast, professional, carrying the particular urgency of something happening ahead of schedule. He pressed into a doorway and watched 3 figures move past in the dim corridor. Not palace guard, not court security, but something else entirely, armored in a way that didn't match any Vulpine military specification he'd studied, moving with the coordinated purpose of a strike team that had done this exact thing before, in other palaces, on other nights. Imperial, he confirmed, watching them round the corridor corner toward the Queen's residential wing. The same Empire he'd just heard planning to let him take the fall for exactly this outcome was apparently running a backup plan in case he failed to deliver. He was, Elias Voss decided, very tired of being a disposable instrument in other people's long games. He checked his weapons, adjusted his grip, and followed the strike team at a dead run toward the one person in this palace he'd come here to kill. He heard the fight before he saw it. The controlled, sharp sound of a close-quarters engagement, furniture overturned, the hiss of a blaster shot fired in an enclosed space, a woman's voice giving orders with a calm that hadn't broken despite whatever was happening to the room around her. He came through the residential chamber's anteroom and into chaos. 2 of the Queen's personal guards down, 1 still fighting, and 3 Imperial operatives pressing an advantage that was going to resolve itself in the next 30 seconds with a predictability that would have been professionally admirable under any other circumstances. The 3rd operative had a blade at the Queen's throat before Elias could do anything about the first 2. He did something about the first 2 anyway, fast and certain, the way he did everything. 2 shots, 2 problems removed from the equation, working with the mechanical, unhesitating efficiency of a man who'd spent 7 years ensuring that efficiency was the only thing anyone could reliably count on from him. The 3rd operative swung toward the new threat, blade still raised, pulling the Queen with him as a shield in a way that someone should have warned him was only going to make the geometry easier rather than harder. Elias calculated angles in the half-second available, took the shot that was there rather than the one he would have preferred, and the operative went down without the blade ever connecting with anything that mattered. The Queen's remaining guard had his spear leveled at Elias's chest before the operative had finished falling. The Queen herself stood in the wreckage of her own bedroom, dressed plainly, no regalia, no crown, and regarded him with the particular, measured stillness of someone who'd had a blade at her throat 30 seconds ago and had not, at any point during that experience, lost the fundamental composure that came from knowing exactly who you were regardless of what was happening around you. "You are not one of them," she said. It wasn't a question, but he answered it anyway. "No. But you are not palace guard." "No." "Then who?" she said, gold eyes steady and measuring across the scattered wreckage of a failed assassination. "Are you?" He was in chains by dawn. Not immediately. There had been a period of shouted questioning, of palace guards summoned in numbers sufficient to make any further violence entirely academic, of the remaining operative's body being examined for identification markers that confirmed, to Elias's mild professional satisfaction, exactly the Imperial origin he'd already told them. But eventually, inevitably, the chains, elegant things, heavy Vulpine alloy, more ceremonial than practical but nonetheless entirely effective, fastened with a precision that suggested the palace staff hadn't always worked in domestic service. They walked him through the palace in the early amber light, through corridors he hadn't been able to see properly during his own approach and could now appreciate with the detached interest of a man who'd already accepted that his immediate future involved significantly less freedom than it had 12 hours ago. The architecture was as impressive close-up as it had been from orbit. The same sense of growth rather than construction, of a civilization that had decided beauty was a structural principle rather than an aesthetic choice. He found himself noting details he had no operational use for, cataloging them anyway out of some instinct older and quieter than professional habit. The throne room was vast, lit by morning light filtered through amber panels that made the whole space look like the inside of something warm and alive. It was full of people. Court, he guessed, a broad spectrum of Vulpine faces ranging from elderly advisors to younger functionaries, all of them wearing the careful, neutral expression of people who'd been informed of an unusual situation and were waiting to determine how alarmed they were supposed to be about it. The Queen sat at the room's center, composed and dressed for court now, the plain sleeping clothes replaced by something that carried authority in the same understated way she seemed to carry everything. Not through ornamentation but through the absolute certainty of her own presence. She looked older in full light than she had in the dark of her chamber. Age settled into the angles of her fox-featured face, silver threading through copper fur, the particular tiredness of someone who'd been responsible for other people's lives for considerably longer than it was possible to carry that responsibility without it leaving marks. But her gold eyes, fixed on him as they brought him forward, were the same, steady, measuring, entirely unimpressed by the drama of his situation. The court buzzed with low, rapid conversation. He caught fragments in the common galactic tongue: mercenary, assassin, human, who sent him, what does the Empire want? And let the fragments wash over him without reaction, keeping his posture easy and his expression neutral, because panic and aggression were both luxuries that tended to foreclose options, and he preferred to keep his options as open as chains currently allowed. The lead advisor, an older Vulpine male with the bearing of someone who'd been the most important person in every room he'd entered for several decades until about 12 hours ago, when the Queen had walked in, stepped forward with a scroll that he didn't actually open, which told Elias the formal charges were being delivered from memory rather than document, which in turn told him that the charges had been prepared in advance of a verdict that was already largely settled. Elias Voss, human, known throughout the frontier reach as a contract agent of significant, and I am advised, considerable reputation for completing engagements regardless of their nature. A brief, loaded pause. You infiltrated the kingdom of Solvane through our eastern perimeter on the night of. He knows when he did it, the Queen said, without particular emphasis. The advisor blinked. Your Majesty. Skip to the charge. A pause that carried a decade's worth of diplomatic adjustment in it. The charge, the advisor said, is infiltration of the sovereign Vulpine Kingdom with lethal intent toward a protected member of the royal family. The court is convened to determine appropriate. I know why we're here, the Queen said. She looked at Elias directly, the way she'd looked at him in the wreckage of her bedroom, with the same steady, unhurried weight. You came here to kill me. It wasn't a question. He noticed she didn't ask many questions she already knew the answers to. Yes, he said. The court erupted. The Queen raised one hand, a small gesture, and it quieted with the speed of long practice. And instead you killed 3 Imperial operatives who were attempting to do the same thing I'd been told you were coming here to do. That's accurate. Tell me, she said, leaning forward fractionally. Why? He considered several answers, sorted them by truth content, and settled on the most honest one available. Because I found out the contract was designed to benefit the people who hired me considerably less than it was designed to benefit the Empire. And I have a professional objection to being used as someone else's instrument without being told that's what's happening. A long silence. The Queen regarded him across the amber-lit space between them, and whatever she found in his face seemed, at least, to satisfy some criterion he wasn't privy to. Honesty, she said, from a hired assassin. Interesting. They held him for 3 days in a cell that was, by the standards of cells he'd occupied in his career, genuinely comfortable. Not a luxury, but a dignity, something about the space that suggested whoever had designed it had considered the possibility that the person inside might be a person rather than merely a problem. He was fed properly, given water for washing, and left alone for long enough stretches that he was able to sleep properly for the first time since leaving the Dusk Runner, which was either a good sign or the prelude to an execution carried out after he'd been properly rested, and he'd spent enough time in enough difficult situations to accept that the distinction might not resolve itself until the relevant moment arrived. On the second day, a young woman appeared at the cell's viewing grill. He'd been doing push-ups, a habit from his early years that stress still triggered without much conscious input, and he stopped when he registered her presence. Not startled, he was too careful to be startled, but pausing in the deliberate way he paused when something new entered a calculation. She was Vulpine, young, the fox-eared, sharp-featured profile immediately recognizable, copper fur lighter than the Queen's, gold eyes carrying the same steadiness but with something additional behind them, something restless and bright that didn't quite fit the careful, quiet architecture of the palace around her. "You're the Mercenary," she said. "That's what people keep calling me. What do you call yourself?" "Elias." He sat on the edge of the sleeping bench, unhurried. "You're the Princess." Something shifted in her expression, not surprise exactly, but a flicker of something that might have been the particular weariness of a person who'd spent their whole life being identified by their title first and themselves second. "Most people in this palace say Your Highness." "I'm not most people in this palace." "No," she said, studying him with open, unguarded curiosity that he found considerably more disarming than any number of formal interrogations. "You really aren't. You saved my mother's life. I killed 3 men. Whether that constitutes saving your mother's life depends on your perspective on the sequence of events. My perspective is that she's alive this morning and 3 Imperial assassins are not, and the difference between those 2 things has a specific cause that happens to be you." She leaned against the grill, something almost casual in the posture, the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to take whatever small physical freedoms were available and use them fully. "Why did you really do it? And I'd like the real answer, not the professional one you gave the court." He looked at her a long moment. The restlessness behind those gold eyes, the thinly contained energy of someone who'd spent a great deal of time in a space that wasn't quite big enough for them, the way she'd pressed herself to the grill, the way a person pressed against a window when outside was where they actually wanted to be. He thought about the professional answer, the clean, distancing language he'd used in the throne room, and found he didn't particularly feel like giving it a second time. "Because I've spent 7 years taking contracts from people who were never going to be held responsible for the outcomes," he said. "Directors and coalitions and governing bodies who needed something done that they couldn't attach their names to. I told myself that was fine because the work was clean, I was honest, I was careful, I didn't hurt people outside the contract, and I completed every job I agreed to complete." A brief pause. "Turns out clean isn't the same as right. Took me 7 years and 1 very badly constructed assignment to figure that out." She was quiet for a moment, studying him. "And now? Now I'm in a cell waiting to find out if your mother's going to have me executed for the contract I came here to complete but didn't." "She's not." He raised an eyebrow. "You know that for certain?" "My mother doesn't waste things. She's been weighing you since the moment you came through the throne room doors, and a woman who built this kingdom out of 40 years of refusing to waste a single resource available to her is not going to execute a man who turned a weapon aimed at her into a defense." She said it simply, matter-of-factly, the tone of someone reporting an observation rather than offering reassurance. "She'll offer you something. She always offers something, because she believes in exchange rather than gift, and she believes every useful thing in the universe deserves to be pointed in a direction that serves something worth serving. And if I decline whatever she offers? Then I imagine she'll let you go," the princess said, "which is somehow both more and less comfortable than the alternative, and I suspect you know that better than I do." He looked at her. The easy intelligence of the conversation, the directness, the restless brightness behind the steadiness, and felt a thread of something pull loose in the careful, compartmentalized architecture of his professional distance that he noticed immediately, and filed away for later examination. "Why did you come here?" he asked. "To the cell." "Curiosity," she said without apology. "I've read about the frontier reach for years. Every account I could find. Every traveler's record, every researcher's log, every archived navigation chart." She glanced away, briefly, toward the amberlit corridor beyond his reach. "This is the closest I've ever come to any of it." The Queen received him on the 4th morning in a smaller chamber off the throne room, not the formal setting of the public court, but a working room, maps and documents spread across a wide table, the particular organized clutter of someone who governed rather than merely reigned. She stood at the table when they brought him in, studying something on a display that she didn't look up from immediately, and he used the few seconds of her inattention to catalog the room the way he always catalogued rooms: exits, angles, personnel, the specific quality of her posture that told him this meeting was something she'd considered carefully rather than called hastily. "Sit," she said finally, without looking up. He sat. The guard who'd brought him positioned himself at the door with a professionalism Elias respected without commenting on. The Queen closed the display and turned to face him, and the full force of her attention was, he had to admit, considerable, the kind of attention that had built something worth protecting over 40 years, that had kept a people hidden and alive and thriving through patience and precision and an absolute refusal to waste anything, including people. "I've reviewed your record," she said. "All of it that I could access, which is, I understand, considerably less than the complete picture, but sufficient to establish a profile." "What profile does it establish?" "A man of significant capability who has spent his career being reliable on behalf of people who didn't deserve reliability from anyone." She sat across from him, folding her hands on the table with the ease of someone who didn't need ceremony to feel authoritative. "The contract you were hired to fulfill was designed by the Empire to accomplish two things simultaneously: my death, and the discrediting of the Frontier Coalition through an act of violence they'd nominally ordered but never intended to survive the scrutiny that follows these things. That was my conclusion as well. The Coalition," she continued, "believed they were hiring an independent operator. They were, in fact, being manipulated by Imperial handlers who'd spent 18 months cultivating the specific fear of Vulpine unification that made this contract seem like a reasonable solution to a manufactured problem. You knew about the manipulation. We suspected. We now have confirmation, thanks to the 3 bodies your intervention left us to examine." A pause. "There is a mole in my court. The location of this kingdom was provided to Imperial intelligence by someone inside these walls. I don't yet know who. I might be able to help with that," he said, thinking of the forest conversation he'd overheard. The young Vulpine woman, court clothes, a guilt carried in the set of her shoulders like a weight she'd already decided was too heavy to keep. "I heard something in the forest on my approach. Give me a description of your court members and I can narrow it considerably." She looked at him for a long moment. "You came here to kill me," she said, "and now you're offering to help me find my traitor. I came here to complete a contract. The contract turned out to be something else. I'm better at adjusting than most people in my line of work. So it appears." She studied him with the same weighing patience her daughter had inherited and expressed in an entirely different register. "Which brings me to the question of what happens next." She unfolded her hands, spread them flat on the table. "You saved my life. Whether you intended to is, ultimately, less relevant than the fact that you did. In this kingdom, that creates an obligation, not legal, not formal, but real regardless. I am prepared to honor it. Name what you want, Elias Voss, and if it is within the power of this kingdom to provide it, I will provide it." He had thought about it. He'd had 3 days in a comfortable cell to think about very little else, which was an unusual amount of thinking time for a man who generally preferred action to reflection, and he'd used it badly at first, running numbers on the treasury, calculating what a kingdom that had spent 40 years building inward rather than outward might have accumulated. Letting his mind trace the outline of the retirement he'd been chasing since his first contract, and finding, at the end of every calculation, the same unsatisfying result. He'd thought about the 3 men he'd killed in the Queen's bedroom and the fact that he'd killed them not because a contract required it but because something in him had already made a decision that the contract didn't cover and his professional machinery hadn't kept up with in time. He'd thought about the forest conversation, the handler's voice, the word disposable sitting in his memory like a stone that wouldn't settle. And he'd thought, more than he'd intended to, about gold eyes through a cell grill and the particular quality of someone pressing against a window toward outside. "There are things I could ask for," he said, meeting the Queen's steady gaze across the wide table. "Money. I know what this kingdom has accumulated over 40 years, at least in general terms, and it's more than I'd spend in a lifetime. Weapons. I know the Vulpine military tradition, I've read the record, the craftsmanship alone would be enough to fund the rest of my career on reputation alone. Land, a title, an official position. He stopped. Let the pause sit exactly long enough. I'm not going to ask for any of those things. The Queen had been watching him with the same unwavering patience she seemed to apply to everything. Then what? She said. Are you going to ask for? Your daughter's freedom. The silence that followed was the specific quality of silence that follows something unexpected in a room full of people who've spent years being unshocked by things. The Queen's expression didn't change, not visibly, not in any way that someone without considerable practice at reading controlled faces would have caught, but something shifted behind it, something deep and old, and immediately guarded. Explain what you mean, she said very quietly. She's been inside this palace her entire life. Inside this kingdom her entire life. She's the last heir to the Vulpine throne, and you've kept her hidden here, safe, because the alternative is a galaxy that'd treat her as either a bargaining chip or a bounty the moment she stepped outside your protection. He kept his voice level, factual, the same tone he used when presenting operational assessments to clients. She told me she's read every account of the frontier reach she could find. Every traveler's log, every navigation chart. She knows more about the galaxy outside these walls than most people who actually live in it, and she has never once been allowed to stand in it. She is the last heir, the Queen said, and the words were measured with a precision that suggested she'd used them before, in arguments she'd had with herself as much as anyone else. I know what she is. I'm asking you to let her be something else, even temporarily. Let her see the things she's been reading about. I'll take the contract, not for pay, not for title, not for anything that benefits me directly, to keep her safe while she does it. 7 years of not losing anyone I was responsible for. That's the record I'm offering you in exchange for permission to show your daughter a single genuine slice of the galaxy she's been locked out of her entire life. A long, searching silence. Then, no. No, the Queen said again, and it had the quality of a door closing rather than a word spoken. You are a stranger, a contracted killer, and a human. I do not know your true nature beyond 3 days of observation. The heir to the Vulpine throne is not a reward I am able to give any person, regardless of what service they have rendered me. Elias nodded once, accepting the answer without argument, which seemed to surprise her slightly. Then I ask for nothing, he said. I'll find my own way out of the kingdom, if you'll grant it, and we can both pretend this was a straightforward failed assassination rather than whatever it actually was. What it actually was, the Queen said slowly, is the most unusual 4 days this palace has seen in 40 years of trying to avoid unusual days. She was quiet a long moment, studying him in a way that made him aware she was doing considerably more processing behind those steady gold eyes than her expression let on. You're not what I expected. People say that. What did you expect to feel, walking in here tonight to complete your contract? Before you found the Imperial operatives. He considered lying, found he couldn't quite manage it. I expected to feel nothing. That's been the professional standard for 7 years. And I didn't feel nothing. Which was inconvenient. Another long pause. I won't give you Sarah, she said, and the name. The princess's real name, dropped into the conversation deliberately, grounding the conversation from title to person, landed with a quiet weight that told him the Queen knew exactly what she was doing by using it. Not now. Not based on 3 days in a cell and 1 night of surprising me. If you want that particular answer from me, Elias Voss, you will have to earn it. How? Stay, she said simply. Help me find my traitor. Help me understand what the Empire is actually planning, because 3 dead operatives tells me a great deal about tonight, and very little about the next 6 months. And let me determine, by watching you rather than by reading a record built by people who hired you for the wrong reasons, what kind of man you actually are. He looked at her across the table, at the patient, precise intelligence that had kept an entire people alive and hidden for 40 years, and recognized in it the specific quality of an offer that was not quite what it appeared on the surface, not merely practical, not merely cautious, but something more careful than that, a woman who loved her daughter enough to be genuinely, systematically ruthless about who she let near her. "All right," he said. "I'll stay." They gave him a room in the palace's eastern wing, not a cell this time, but a guest suite that managed to be both genuinely comfortable and clearly positioned with his easy recapture in mind, should the Queen's assessment of his character turn out to be optimistic. He didn't resent the calculation. He would have made the same one. He found the traitor in 4 days. The forest conversation had given him a profile. Female, young enough that her guilt still wore visibly, court-adjacent, with enough access to classified navigational information to have provided the kingdom's location to Imperial intelligence. 3 people fit the profile on initial review. Careful observation narrowed it to 1. A junior court archivist named Tessav, who moved through the palace with the particular, compensatory confidence of someone who'd made a decision they hadn't finished justifying to themselves, whose routing through the archive rooms showed a pattern of access too tidy and too regular to be anything but deliberate. He brought the information to the Queen on the 4th evening, laid it out without drama or embellishment, the way he'd always delivered operational assessments. Clean, factual, every inference labeled as inference, every confirmed observation labeled as confirmed. She listened without interrupting, asked 3 questions that told him she'd already suspected Tessav and was confirming rather than discovering, and sat with the answer for a long, quiet moment before speaking. "Thank you," she said. "This would have taken us considerably longer without your particular set of skills, and I want you to know I understand the difference between doing something useful because you were asked to and doing something useful because you chose to." "I chose to," he said simply. "Yes." She studied him. "Sarah tells me you were honest with her in the cell. About your reasons." She asked for the real answer. She usually does. It's one of her more inconvenient qualities. A ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it moved across the Queen's face and disappeared. "She also told me that you listened to her, which is something the court has difficulty managing as often as it should. She says more in a conversation than most people bother to hear. She's observant. And she asks better questions than most of my former clients. Higher bar than you might think," the Queen said dryly, and this time the almost smile held a moment longer. Tessav was taken quietly, without the kind of public spectacle that would have warned whatever Imperial handlers she was still in contact with that her usefulness had expired. The Queen was patient in that particular way, patient about process, patient about not wasting the value of what she knew by deploying it carelessly. Elias sat in on the questioning at the Queen's invitation, said nothing, catalogued everything, and came away with a considerably more complete picture of the Empire's actual interest in the Vulpine Kingdom than the Coalition's intelligence had managed to assemble in considerably more time and expense. The Empire wasn't just interested in the trade routes. That was the manufactured reason, the tidy explanation fed to the Frontier Coalition to give them a motivation that made sense without revealing the actual one. The actual one, assembled from Tessav's disclosures and the dead operative's equipment, and the pattern of Imperial positioning across the frontier reach that Elias had spent 3 years professionally watching from the inside. The Empire wanted the Vulpine genetic archive. 40 years of isolation had allowed the kingdom to maintain biological records that the rest of the galaxy's expansion had erased, species information that had scientific and military applications that the Empire's research division had been quietly, systematically investing in acquiring by any means available. Reina Solvang, which was how he'd come to think of the Queen, separate from her title, the person behind the authority, heard this conclusion and sat with it for longer than she'd sat with anything else he told her. "They don't want to collapse the kingdom," she said finally. "They want to own it. They want what you've built here," Elias confirmed. "The unification your opponents are afraid of isn't the military threat. It's the consolidation of the archive under a single, Unified authority that's too organized to pick apart piece by piece. And the assassination buys them chaos. A destabilized kingdom without a queen is easier to approach with resources rather than violence. Factions they can manage. A unified people under strong leadership, harder. He paused. You're not a threat to the frontier worlds. You're a threat to an Imperial acquisition that nobody outside that specific research division knows they've been planning. She looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize. Not surprise exactly, but the careful recalibration of a plan already in motion against information that changed its parameters. You are considerably more useful than I expected, she said. And considerably less what a 7-year record of mercenary contract work led me to anticipate. People keep saying that too. I imagine they do, Reyna said, and this time the not-quite smile stayed. The palace of Solvane had, like most places inhabited by power for long enough, its own rhythms and its own gravity, and Elias Voss discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't resist the pull of it the way he'd always resisted settling anywhere. He ran his morning perimeter checks like a habit he couldn't shake, catalogued the security weak points he found and submitted them to the Queen's Guard captain with a professionalism that seemed to confuse the captain more than it reassured him, and spent the rest of his days in a shifting combination of intelligence work for the Queen and conversations with the Princess that he increasingly found himself seeking out rather than merely happening upon. Sarah Solvane was, up close and in daylight, everything her brief Seldor impression had suggested and considerably more. She read everything available to her with a discipline that looked effortless but wasn't, had opinions about galactic politics that would have embarrassed most of the people currently running galactic politics, and possessed the particular, quiet stubbornness of someone who'd spent a lifetime arguing with a world that told her the walls around her were for her own good. You said you've read every traveler's log from the Frontier Reach, Elias said one afternoon. The two of them settled in the palace library while a warm afternoon light came through amber panels above. Every one I could access. Which is every one that was ever cross-referenced in the kingdom's archive, so quite a lot. She glanced up from the document she'd been reviewing. Why? Because there's a discrepancy between what the logs describe and what the Reach actually is. The logs are mostly written by people who arrived somewhere with something to sell and left when they'd sold it. The texture is wrong. What's the real texture? He thought about it. Loud. Crowded. A lot of people trying to be braver than they actually are, because the Reach rewards bravery whether it's genuine or performed, and some of them don't live long enough to learn the difference. But also, he paused, looking for the honest description rather than the professional one. Alive. In a way that's hard to find in places where things have already been decided. She was watching him with an intensity that she hadn't learned to moderate in the way the court had learned to moderate most of its reactions. You miss it. I didn't know I did, he said, which was the most honest answer available, and also, he realized immediately after saying it, a considerably more personal thing to admit to a princess he'd known for 10 days than his professional distance usually allowed. The second Imperial attempt came 3 weeks into his stay, and it came differently than the first, not a strike team in the night, but an approach through the court itself, a trio of newly arrived trade delegates with impeccable forged credentials and a specific, patient objective that Elias identified on their third day in the palace purely through the pattern of their attention. Trade delegates looked at trade goods. These three looked at people, and the people they looked at formed a constellation with Sarah Solvane at its center. He told the Queen. She authorized a covert watch rather than an immediate arrest, wanting to trace the communication thread back to its source before cutting it. Elias ran the watch himself, 3 days of careful observation that produced exactly the intelligence she'd wanted, and on the night the delegates made their move. Not toward the Queen this time, but toward Sarah, a quieter target. A leverage rather than an endpoint, he was already in position. The confrontation was brief. 2 of the 3 delegates didn't get the opportunity to demonstrate whether they had combat training worth respecting. The third, finding herself alone and suddenly faced with a man whose professional reputation she'd apparently not fully researched before accepting this assignment, made the reasonable decision to surrender rather than discover the hard way why that reputation existed. Sarah, who had been moments from being seized, stood in the aftermath of the skirmish with a composure that would have impressed him even if he hadn't spent 3 weeks watching her practice it under less extreme conditions. "You knew," she said. "3 days ago. You waited. Your mother wanted the communication thread." She looked at him, the fight's detritus scattered around them, her evening reading interrupted by something she'd never encountered inside these walls before, and he watched several things move through her expression in quick succession. The delayed shock she was managing without showing it, a careful assessment of her own reactions, and underneath it all, something that wasn't fear but was learning to live in the same house as it. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then, more honestly, "I think so. It's different, isn't it? Reading about the galaxy's dangers and having them come through your library door are not the same experience." "No," he agreed gently. "They're not." "I still want to see it," she said, with the particular quiet firmness of someone who's just been given every reason to change their mind and has considered the change and rejected it. "Outside, I mean. All of it. Even the dangerous parts. Maybe especially those." He looked at her a long time. "I know," he said. "I know you do." He went back to the Queen after the delegate's interrogation was complete, carrying the communication thread she'd wanted and something else alongside it. A clearer, harder picture of the Empire's timeline and resources than either of them had possessed before. "They'll keep trying," he said, not preamble, just assessment. "The archive is the objective and Sarah is the clearest pressure point they've identified to reach it. Killing you destabilizes the kingdom. Taking her gives them leverage to extract what they want without the political fallout of an outright assassination." "I know." The Queen set down the interrogation report, folded her hands. "I have always known. It is why she has never left. Keeping her here isn't making her safer anymore. The Empire knows where the kingdom is. Your location was compromised by the mole, and the mole's been communicating for at least 6 months. This is not the secret it was before I landed." He kept his voice even, knowing he was walking onto ground that carried a weight of 23 years of maternal decision-making and love and fear, and he had no right to dismiss any of it. The safest place for Sarah Sylvain right now is somewhere that isn't in a known location with a known threat profile. "You are suggesting I let her go," the Queen said. "With you specifically." "I'm suggesting the alternative is waiting for a third attempt with better resources, and the third attempt will be designed with the specific knowledge that the last 2 didn't work." He paused. "I'm also suggesting that even if the Empire weren't a factor, she deserves to see the galaxy she's been reading about for 23 years. Both things can be true simultaneously." Reyna Sylvain looked at him with the expression he'd come to understand was her deepest processing register. Not cold, not distant, but entirely, profoundly internal, a woman running calculations that encompassed everything she'd built, and everything she loved and every possible outcome she could project from the information available to her. He waited, the way he'd learned to wait during the weeks he'd spent here, because some things needed to be arrived at rather than argued toward. "She is my last heir," the Queen said finally. "The last. If something happens to her, the Vulpine line ends with her." "I don't lose people I'm responsible for," Elias said. 7 years. "I know what the record actually means by now, and it means that. A record built protecting targets who were never the most important thing in the galaxy to anyone. I know she is to you," he said quietly. "That's why I came back and asked again." A very long silence. Outside the chamber, the palace breathed its amber evening light across corridors he'd memorized in 3 weeks the way he never memorized anything from sentiment alone. "If I say yes," the Queen said at last, "it is not a reward. It is a trust. And if you break it, you'll never have to decide what to do about it," Elias said. "Because if anything happens to her, it'll mean I'm already dead." She studied him for a final, measuring moment. Then, bring her home safe, she said. That's the only contract I'm offering you. Done, he said. Sarah Sylvain stood at the Duskrunner's viewport and did not speak for a very long time, and Elias let the silence hold without filling it, because some moments were better for being witnessed than narrated. They broke in orbit an hour ago, the kingdom's amber sun shrinking behind them, and now there was nothing outside the viewport but open space. The full, indifferent, magnificent dark that she'd been reading about since before she'd been old enough to understand what she was longing for. It's bigger, she said finally. Than the logs describe? Than anything describes. The logs have words for it. None of the words are right. She pressed one hand against the viewport glass, the gesture of someone confirming that the glass was actually there, that the space beyond it was actually real and not another account to be catalogued and set aside. How long before you stop being stunned by it? You don't, entirely, he said. You get used to operating inside it. The stunned part stays underneath. People who stop feeling it are usually the people who've been running from something for long enough that they've stopped noticing what they're running through. She glanced at him sideways, the gold eyes catching what little light the viewports glow through. Is that what you were doing? Running? I told myself I was building towards something. Retirement. The right number in the right account, and then I'd stop. Turned out the number I was building toward didn't actually correspond to anything I wanted once I got close enough to see it clearly. What do you want instead? He thought about several answers. Something I can point to and say it mattered. Whatever that ends up meaning. She turned back to the stars, quiet again, and he watched her take in the first real horizon she'd ever seen, infinite, unmapped, entirely indifferent to who she was or what she was heir to. And felt something in his chest settle, the particular satisfaction of having been the thing that brought a locked door to the right key, which was a dangerous feeling to have about a princess you'd technically been contracted to protect. The first stop was Veth Station, a frontier trading post on the far edge of the Reach, busy enough to lose themselves in and small enough that Imperial reach was more theoretical than operational. Elias had used it as a resupply point twice before and knew its layout the way he knew most places he'd returned to, not fondly, but accurately. For Sarah, it was everything. She moved through the station's market level with the focused, radiant attention of someone trying to process multiple simultaneous wonders without losing any of them, stopping at vendor stalls to ask questions that were so genuinely curious, and so entirely without pretense that the vendors answered them in kind, surprised out of the usual transactional efficiency by a customer who actually wanted to know how things worked. This is grain from 4 different systems, a vendor told her, demonstrating something about soil chemistry she'd asked about, pleased and slightly confused by her interest. You blend them right, the bread tastes like something your grandmother made even if your grandmother never ate any of these grains. I'll take some of each, Sarah said immediately. I want to try it. You cook? Elias asked, once they'd moved on. I've read extensively about cooking. I haven't had many opportunities to practice. The Duskrunner has a galley. I know. I've already inventoried it. It's a disaster. It functions. Barely. She was already moving toward the next stall, the particular energy she carried inside palace walls finally given the space it needed to express itself in full, and it was, he noticed, with the professional detachment he was finding harder and harder to maintain consistently, extraordinary to watch. You eat out of ration packs. I've watched you do it for 3 days. That's not eating, that's maintenance. I've managed. You've survived. There's a difference, you know. It's the same difference as what separates a log's account of the frontier reach from actually standing in it. He thought about that for a moment. Fair point, he said, and followed her to the next stall, which turned out to sell 3 kinds of things he'd never thought to try and one kind he'd actively been avoiding for years, all of which Sarah purchased with the focused enthusiasm of someone who'd decided that the galaxy was a place to be tasted rather than simply navigated. The Empire found them on Veth Station on the 3rd day, which was faster than Elias had expected and entirely in keeping with the Imperial intelligence apparatus's general approach to inconvenient problems, thorough, methodical, and considerably better resource than anything available on the frontier's side of the equation. He spotted the tail first. A pair of plainclothes operatives who moved through the market level with the particular practiced casualness of people who'd been trained to blend in and didn't quite, the way formal training always left a slight, uncanny quality to the naturalness it was trying to produce. He spotted them without changing his own pattern, filed them, and spent 20 minutes confirming a third before updating his route to a less pleasant section of the station where the operatives would have to commit to following or lose the track. "Don't look behind us," he said quietly, close enough to Sarah that the instruction read as normal conversation to any watcher. "Are we being followed?" 3. Possibly 4. To her considerable credit, she didn't tense visibly, didn't glance back, didn't do any of the things that someone who'd never been followed before tended to do. "What do we do?" "I make a complication. You stay within arm's reach and don't do anything I haven't asked you to do." "All right. That means specifically that if things go loud, you don't try to help. I have some combat training," she said with the matter-of-fact dignity of someone who considered this relevant information. "How much?" "Palace instruction. Blade work, mostly. Some hand-to-hand basics. Useful and noted. Still don't try to help. Palace instruction and open station brawling are different categories, and I'd rather be concentrating on the people I'm managing than accounting for your position in a fight." "Fine," she said, which had the quality of a provisional agreement rather than a permanent one, and he filed that too. He used a service junction he'd catalogued on his first hour aboard the station, the kind of unremarkable infrastructure shortcut that stations universally possessed and that most people never thought to learn in advance. And the 3 operatives who'd been carrying a practiced casual pursuit were suddenly navigating the considerably less practiced experience of losing their target in an area of the station that wasn't on the public map. The 4th, the one he hadn't fully confirmed yet, turned out to be the most careful of them, adjusting fastest, and the confrontation happened in a maintenance corridor that was narrow enough to be defensible and loud enough, with the station's ventilation, to swallow noise. He had the 4th operative's hands secured and her communication device disabled in under 60 seconds. Sarah stood 3 meters back watching him work, and when it was done, she said quietly, "You really are very good at this. It's what I do." "Is it still satisfying?" she asked. "After 7 years?" He looked at her over the secured operative, genuinely uncertain of the answer in a way he hadn't been uncertain about much in a long time. "Ask me again in a year," he said. "Something about the context has changed." They ran. Not in the panicked, reactive way of people who'd been surprised, but in the deliberate, controlled way that Elias had spent 7 years learning to distinguish from flight. Purposeful movement through consecutive calculated positions, each step informed by the one before it, with enough distance between them and the Imperial tail on Veth Station that they could pick their next destination without being followed to it. The Dusk Runner was already burning out of docking range before the station's security apparatus had been fully notified that anything had happened, which was another skill Elias had developed and refined over years of departures that didn't benefit from leisurely goodbyes. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, standing in the cockpit doorway with her new market purchases in a bag that had survived the corridor confrontation without losing a single grain from any of the 4 systems. "Somewhere the Empire won't expect," he said. "Which means somewhere nobody with good sense would choose to go, generally. That could describe most of the places I want to see." He looked at her. "You have a list. I have several lists. Cross-referenced and organized by accessibility, which has until recently been the primary criterion since everything on the list was theoretical. What's number 1 on the list that isn't organized by accessibility?" She sat down in the co-pilot's seat with the same ease she'd assumed it the first day aboard, already treating it as hers in the unself-conscious way she treated most things she'd decided were worth claiming. "The Caliph Drift. The ruins there. Pre-Imperial civilization, nobody's consensus on what they actually were, conflicting accounts that are all probably wrong. I want to see what they actually look like and form my own opinion. He thought about the Caliph Drift. Remote, minimally patrolled, the kind of place that attracted researchers and scavengers in roughly equal measure, and was too marginal to have much Imperial strategic value. That's actually a reasonable suggestion. I have a lot of reasonable suggestions, she said. Nobody has generally been interested in hearing them. I'm interested, he said, and meant it, and watched the quiet surprise that crossed her face at an entirely ordinary statement of interest, the surprise of someone unaccustomed to being taken at face value rather than at title, and felt the thing that had been pulling loose in his professional architecture since the night in the cell grill tug a little further free. The Caliph Drift took 2 jumps and 4 days of travel, and the 4 days were. Elias admitted to himself sometime around day 3, in the particular, vulnerable honesty of a man who'd been alone for so long that company had become impossible to ignore, the most genuinely good 4 days he'd had in longer than he was comfortable calculating. She cooked, and it turned out the extensive reading translated into something real, not perfectly, not without considerable improvised problem-solving in the Duskrunner's barely adequate galley, but genuinely, surprisingly good. She argued with him about navigation, not because she thought she knew better but because she was interested in understanding the reasoning, which was a different thing entirely, and considerably harder to dismiss. She read constantly, but differently from how she'd read inside the palace, with interruptions, with questions, with the particular electric quality of someone applying text to immediate experience rather than filing it for a future that had always felt hypothetical. On the 3rd evening, she asked him why he'd become a mercenary. Money, he said, which was true but incomplete. That's the first answer. What's the one under it? He was quiet a moment, stirring something on the galley's single functional burner that she'd improved considerably from the raw ingredient state with instructions she delivered over her shoulder without condescension. I'm good at it, he said finally. I grew up on a frontier world where the things I turned out to be good at. Reading people, moving quietly, making decisions fast without a lot of second-guessing, were the skills that got you paid. The mercenary path was the organized version of what I'd been doing informally since I was old enough to do it informally. It felt like finding the right shape for a thing I already was. Do you miss the frontier world? No. I miss the person I was before I knew enough to know what I was doing. He paused. That's not exactly right. I miss the version of the future that person thought they were building toward. What were you building toward? Didn't know. Something simple, I think. Something that was mine. He looked at the stars through the galley's small porthole, long streaks in the jump drive's artificial passage of time. You know the thing about the galaxy. When you've been through as much of it as I have? Most of it isn't actually that different from most other parts of it. The cultures differ, the people differ, the dangers differ. But the thing underneath, the wanting to matter, the wanting to be seen, the wanting to have something you can point to and say this is mine and I built it, that's the same everywhere I've ever been. She was quiet a moment. Then, what would yours look like? The thing you could point to. He didn't answer immediately, and the not answering was itself, he suspected, more honest than whatever words he might have used instead. The Caliph ruins were real. They were also, in Sarah's assessment, delivered with the brisk certainty of someone who'd reviewed every conflicting account available, and come prepared to evaluate primary evidence. Entirely unlike any of the descriptions, in the best possible way. They stood among them in the early light of the drift's single pale sun. Enormous curved structures, organic in their geometry, material that wasn't quite stone and wasn't quite anything else he had a word for, covered in markings that the linguists had spent a century arguing about without resolution. The scale was the thing the records had failed to convey, not just tall, but vast, each structure containing dimensions that made standing inside one feel like standing inside the idea of a building rather than an actual physical one. Pre-unification, she said, walking slowly through the nearest structure's interior, gold eyes moving over the wall markings with a focused attention that she wore like light. before the Empire organized everyone into a comprehensible political structure. This civilization made these choices about what a building meant without any of the influences that have shaped every structure built in the last 200 years. Is that what makes it worth seeing? The absence of familiar influences? Partly. She stopped at a section of wall where the markings clustered densest. But also just this. Proof that something was here. That it mattered enough to leave a mark, even if we don't know anymore what the mark meant. She touched the wall lightly, fingertips against the not-quite stone. I spent 23 years inside walls that told me I was the most important thing inside them. These walls say something was important here once, and we don't even know its name anymore. Both things can be true simultaneously, and I find the second one more honest, somehow. He watched her with the drift's pale light falling across her, and the ancient markings and the silence of a place that had outlasted everything it had been built for, and found that the careful professional distance he'd spent 7 years maintaining had, somewhere between the cell grill and a galley argument about navigation and this exact moment, become impossible to maintain any longer. "Sarah," he said, meaning to say something useful, something operational, something that lived in the appropriate category of contractor rather than person. She looked at him over her shoulder, gold eyes steady and completely, devastatingly direct. "I know," she said, as if she'd been waiting for him to figure out what she already had. The message from the kingdom arrived 3 weeks into their journey, relayed through a secure channel the Queen had given Elias before departure. One of 3, with the instruction that the second channel's activation meant urgency, and the third meant crisis. She used the second. The voice in the message was the Queen's, stripped of everything but information, the same flat, precise register she'd used to present intelligence assessments in her working chamber. An Imperial fleet, not a strike team, not operatives, a fleet, had positioned itself at the edge of the system. Not yet inside Vulpine sovereign space, but at a distance that constituted an unmistakable statement of intent. The Frontier Coalition had collapsed, its 3 representatives withdrawn, Dresser's name appearing in connection with an Imperial trade agreement that had been in negotiation since before the coalition had ever commissioned Elias's contract. The political context that had made the assassination seem logical had, the Queen's voice confirmed without dramatics, been entirely manufactured from the start. "I have begun preparations," she said at the message's end, and didn't specify for what, because she didn't need to, and they both understood what the word preparations meant for a queen facing a fleet and no diplomatic options. Sarah listened to the message twice, very still, and Elias watched the thing happen that he'd known since the Caliph ruins was always eventually going to happen, the galaxy outside pressing back against the freedom she'd been given, the crown she'd been born to reassembling itself out of the distance between her and everything she'd left behind. "We have to go back," she said. "We don't have to do anything. She's alone. The fleet is there, and she is alone, and every decision she makes from here is made without anyone to." She stopped, controlled the edge in her voice with a visible, deliberate effort. "She's my mother. And she sent me away to keep me safe while she faces this, which is exactly the kind of decision she would make, and exactly the kind of decision I cannot allow her to make alone." "If we go back," Elias said carefully, "we go back into a situation with a significantly worse threat profile than the one we left. I know. An Imperial fleet isn't operatives. It isn't bounty hunters. It's a different order of magnitude entirely. I know, Elias." She turned to look at him, and her face had the same quality her mother's carried in serious moments, deep, still, utterly resolved in a way that had decided and was not asking permission. "I'm not asking you to come. You've already given me something I'll have for the rest of my life regardless of what happens next. You've fulfilled every promise you made. I'm not asking for anything more from you." "You're not asking," he said, "because you already know what I'm going to say." She looked at him. "Tell me anyway." "We're going back," he said. "Together. Because that's the contract. You don't have a contract anymore. My mother granted my freedom. The obligation ended the moment we left the system. I'm not talking about the one your mother granted, he said. I'm talking about the one I gave myself, which is a different document entirely and not something I have the option of renegotiating. She held his gaze a long moment, and something in it softened, not the resolve, which was fixed as anything he'd ever seen, but something around it, something that recognized him and said so without requiring the acknowledgement to be spoken aloud. All right, she said. Together, then. They came back through the perimeter at speed, the dusk runner burning hard, and found the kingdom in a state that was not quite crisis but was standing immediately adjacent to it, the careful, quiet order of the palace transformed into the controlled urgency of people who'd spent 40 years preparing for the thing they'd always hoped never to actually face. The Queen received them in the war room. A space Elias hadn't known existed and should have, its presence behind the palace's eastern wing a testament to how well the Queen's preparations had been hidden from even a careful observer, surrounded by her senior advisors and her guard captain and the particular, absolute composure of a woman who'd known this was possible for 40 years and had never once let herself be surprised by its arrival. She looked at Sarah first, for one brief, unguarded moment that carried 23 years of love and fear and relief in it, and then composed herself back into the Queen before anyone else in the room could fully register what they'd seen. You came back, she said. I told him to keep you safe. He kept me safe, Sarah said. I chose to come back. There's a difference, and I need you to understand it's mine. Something passed between them. The specific, complicated frequency of a mother and daughter who loved each other across an argument they'd been having for 23 years, either of whom was wrong, both of whom were too similar to easily find the resolution. The Queen held it for a second, then released it with the efficiency of someone who understood which problems could wait, and which ones couldn't. The fleet, Elias said, because someone needed to move the conversation toward the operational reality. What are their current demands? Access to the archive, the guard captain said. Framed as a research partnership, which is the diplomatic language for give us what we want without making us take it by force, and we will allow you the courtesy of pretending this was voluntary. The deadline is 72 hours. How long before they can enforce it militarily? Given fleet positioning, best estimate puts an initial strike capacity at 60 hours. They're hoping the deadline produces a result before they have to demonstrate the alternative. Elias stood in the war room and did what he'd always done in rooms full of bad options, catalogued them, weighted them, and began the specific mental work of finding the least bad available path. He worked through the night alongside the Queen's advisors, a collaboration that started formal and became, by the small hours, something considerably more functional. The Queen's people were good, patient, knowledgeable in the specific ways that 40 years of building a hidden kingdom produced knowledge, and Elias brought what they didn't have, a current, experiential understanding of Imperial operational patterns developed from the inside of its orbit, and a complete absence of the particular, paralyzing attachment to outcomes that sometimes made brilliant people unable to commit to a workable solution because it wasn't a perfect one. The archive can be moved, he said somewhere around 3 a.m, the war room's maps spread across every available surface. Not all of it. Not in 72 hours. But the most irreplaceable elements, the genetic records, the pre-war documentation, the research that can't be reconstructed, those can be extracted on a fast ship and moved to a secondary location before the fleet's deadline expires. A fast ship, the guard captain said, with the tone of a man who knew exactly which fast ship was being discussed. The Dusk Runner can carry the archive's core in 3 loads. She's the fastest thing currently sitting on your landing pad, and she's already registered to a profile the Empire hasn't yet had time to flag as connected to this situation. 3 loads, Sarah said, not a question, doing the same math he had. 3 runs through a fleet perimeter in 72 hours. 2. Elias said. I'll make 2. The third. He paused, and looked at the Queen, and found her already looking back at him with the expression of someone who'd already understood where this was going, and had already made her own separate calculation about it. The third run is the one where someone has to ensure the fleet's attention is directed elsewhere long enough for the window to close behind the ship. The room was very quiet. A distraction, the guard captain said. A sacrifice, the Queen said, and her voice was perfectly steady and entirely without self-pity, the voice of a woman who'd built something worth protecting and had always understood, at its bedrock foundation, that protecting it might eventually cost exactly this. Sarah heard the word and went very still. Elias watched it happen. The stillness of someone who'd understood before the conversation caught up, who'd been doing their own quiet calculation through the 3 hours of war room planning and had arrived at the same conclusion from a different direction. No, Sarah said. Sarah. No. There are other ways to create a distraction. There are signals we can send, communications we can fabricate, tactical. They have a fleet, the Queen said, with the particular gentleness of someone being ruthlessly honest in the kindest possible register. A fabricated signal buys minutes. What we need is hours. And the only thing this fleet will devote hours to is the one thing it actually came here to acquire. Then give it to them, Sarah said, and the rawness in her voice, the cracks in the careful composure she'd been maintaining, told Elias everything about how much force of will was currently holding her together. Give them access to the archive. Negotiate. You've built 40 years of. If I give them the archive, the kingdom survives the next 6 months and ends on Imperial terms in the 6 months after that, Raina said. Everything I have built here, everything everyone here has worked their entire lives to protect, becomes an Imperial resource library. The Vulpine people become a managed civilization, administered rather than free. She paused. I have spent 40 years ensuring that outcome did not happen. I am not going to accept it now to protect myself. You are not a sacrifice, Sarah said, and the crack was fully audible now. You are my mother. I am both things, the Queen said. And the Queen in me has known for a long time that this moment was the risk that the freedom was built on. I am not afraid of it. I need you to not be afraid of it either, which is a greater thing to ask of you than anything I have ever asked, and I know that. The room had cleared without being asked, the guard captain and advisors finding quiet exits, the professional courtesy of people who understood when a conversation needed walls around it. Elias started to move toward the door as well, and the Queen said, without looking at him, Stay. This concerns you. He stayed. He stood at the room's edge and let the conversation happen between them, mother and daughter, the most important conversation in either of their lives, and tried to be present without intruding, a distinction he'd always been better at in the field than in the specific, unbearable intimacy of watching people he cared about face things he couldn't solve by being fast or careful or precise. You gave me my freedom, Sarah said. Her voice had steadied again, the cracks sealed by the same discipline she'd learned from the woman across from her. You gave it to me knowing you might never see it come back. You did that because you loved me more than you needed to keep me safe. Yes, the Queen said. Then let me make the same choice. Let me stay here, with the kingdom, with the... No. And now the Queen's voice finally cracked too. A hairline fracture, barely audible, the sound of 40 years of a wall that had never broken finally finding its single point of vulnerability. What I am asking of you, Sarah, is the hardest thing I will ever ask of you. I am asking you to leave again. To go with Elias, with the archive, with the future of this people and the cargo hold of a very fast ship, and to not look back. To build what comes next, because someone has to, and you are the only person who can. There will be no throne to come back to. There will be a people, the Queen said quietly. Scattered, perhaps. Pursued, certainly. Rebuilt from archive fragments and stubbornness and whatever you can manage to make in the time you have. The throne is a chair in a building. The people are the actual thing, and you are the last heir to them, not to the furniture. Sarah looked at her mother for a long time. And then she crossed the room, and the Queen held her, the way she must have held her when she was small and the galaxy had still seemed manageable, and Elias looked at the war room's maps and thought about the contract, The real one, the one he'd given himself. And understood, with the particular clarity of a man who just watched the most important thing he'd ever protected become the most important thing he'd ever been trusted to keep safe, exactly what the next 72 hours required of him. The plan ran precisely to schedule the way plans never did, which was not because the execution was perfect but because Elias had spent 7 years building enough redundancy into every plan that the inevitable imperfections didn't cascade into failure. The first run. The archive's core genetic records, packed with military efficiency by the kingdom's archivists into cases that had clearly been designed for exactly this possibility, with a care that suggested the Queen had been mentally preparing this extraction for years. Went clean, the Duskrunner slipping through the fleet's outer perimeter on a vector that used the system's asteroid field the same way Elias had used it once before, in a different emergency, trusting different math to produce a survivable outcome. It did. He docked the first load at a secondary location the Queen had established on a dead moon 2 systems over, reprogrammed with coordinates she'd given him in the war room, and then destroyed the paper record of, and turned around immediately for the second run. The second run was harder. The fleet had noticed the first, the math of a small fast ship making an unexpected exit too clean to be coincidental even to Imperial pattern recognition, and the perimeter had tightened. He talked himself through it the same way he talked himself through every close approach in 7 years, not calmly, because calmness was a lie people told themselves about what professional competence felt like from the inside. The inside felt like controlled terror, and the difference between a professional and an amateur was what they did with it. He cleared the second perimeter with a margin he'd have found unacceptable in advance and acceptable in retrospect, the way margins always were, and carried the second load to the dead moon with hands that stopped shaking on the return burn once the adrenaline had somewhere to go besides the cockpit. One more load. And the distraction that made it possible. He was still calculating the third run's variables when the Queen's signal came through on the second channel, and then immediately on the third. He ran back to the palace and found Sarah already at the Queen's communication console, face the color of something that had gone entirely internal, composure so locked down that the force of what she was holding made her look carved rather than still. "She's already moved," Sarah said. "She's already." "What did she do?" "She transmitted a direct communication to the Imperial Fleet Commander. Open frequency, encrypted enough to slow the response but not stop it. She's announced a formal diplomatic audience at the palace's main gate, herself, in full regalia, the full court, a negotiation she has no intention of concluding but every intention of prolonging." The voice was controlled but the hands weren't, gripped white-knuckled on the console edge. "She's giving us 6 hours minimum, possibly 8. She said. A breath. She said to tell you the last load is in the East Archive vault, packed and ready, and that the access code is Sarah's birth date. Elias stood very still for exactly 3 seconds, doing the same calculation the Queen had done and arriving at the same answer from the operational side. "We need to go. She's buying us time with. She's doing the thing she decided to do, and she decided it clearly and completely, and the thing you can give her in return is making it count." He put his hands on Sarah's shoulders, felt the force of everything she was holding. "She asked you for the hardest thing she'd ever asked? I'm asking for the second hardest. We need to move. Right now. While the window holds." Sarah looked at him, gold eyes carrying everything that had no other place to go, and nodded once. "Right now," she said. "Yes." They ran. The third run was the hardest thing Elias Vos had ever done, and he had done hard things in significant quantity across a career built on doing them. Not because the flight itself was technically more demanding than the second run's tight perimeter clearance, but because he was doing it with Sarah sitting in the co-pilot's seat in full, silent awareness of what was happening on the surface below them, and every second of the 6-hour window the Queen was buying them with her own body and her formal regalia and 40 years of practice. Certain authority was a second of their departure threading through the needle of her mother's sacrifice. He didn't try to fill the silence. There was nothing in the right category to put into it, and Sarah, her mother's daughter in this as in everything else, was not someone who needed inadequate words poured into a grief that was too real and too present for inadequacy. He flew. She sat. The Duskrunner cleared the outer perimeter with a margin he'd have called comfortable under any other circumstances, and on the fleet's long-range sensors the diplomatic audience below would still be in progress, the Queen managing an Imperial fleet commander across a negotiating table with the patience of someone who'd spent 40 years refusing to waste a single available moment, extracting every minute possible from the window she'd opened. He reached the dead moon and docked the third load and sat for a moment in the docking tube's silence with his hands off the controls, the way he sat after every close call in 7 years, letting his body understand that the immediate danger was past before asking it to do anything else. "She's going to be captured," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said, because lying to her had never been something he could manage, and trying now would have been the worst possible use of the trust she'd given him. "Will they kill her?" "No," he said, with more certainty than he'd put into many assessments of Imperial behavior. "She's more valuable as a political prisoner than as a casualty. An archived queen creates diplomatic problems. A martyred one creates a movement. She knows that. She's been thinking about Imperial strategy longer than I've been alive. She knows every version of what happens next." He looked at her profile against the dead moon's reflected starlight through the viewport. "She chose this because it was the version where the archive survives and you survive and the people survive, and those three things together outweighed every personal cost in her calculation. She wouldn't want you to believe she made the choice without fully knowing what it cost." "I know she knew," Sarah said softly. "That's the part that makes it impossible." They spent 2 days on the dead moon, organizing the archive loads, setting up the secure relay network the Queen had outlined in her final communications, doing the practical work of the future with hands that needed to be busy because the alternative was grief with nowhere to put itself. Sarah worked with the same focused, total efficiency she brought to everything, and Elias let her lead the organization of the archive because it was hers more than his, the intellectual and biological inheritance of a people, and he was the safeguard rather than the steward. On the second evening she came and sat beside him in the Duskrunner's cockpit, the archive secured behind them in the dead moon's storage chambers, and looked at the stars for a long time. "I have to go back eventually," she said. "Not now. Not soon, probably. But eventually. She built the kingdom for a reason that doesn't expire when she does. I know. And the people are scattered now. Some will find their way to other systems, other communities. But the ones who know what the kingdom was, who remember what we were building, they need someone to build toward. I know that too." "You've already been thinking about this," she said, something between observation and accusation. "I've been thinking about the logistics, yes. The secondary network locations the Queen established. The Vulpine survivors who already know the archive exists. What a new center of gravity for those people would need in terms of resources and security, and someone willing to do the slow, unremarkable work of building something worth protecting from the beginning rather than from the middle." She looked at him. "That's what you said you wanted. Something you could point to." "Something you can point to," he corrected. "I'm considerably better at the fast, dangerous, unremarkable work of making sure something worth building gets the space it needs to be built. 2 different jobs. They tend to need each other. You're saying you'll stay?" "I'm saying I've been staying," he said. "Since the night I looked at a cell grill and found you on the other side of it already asking better questions than anyone had asked me in 7 years. I just took a while to admit the staying was a choice I'd made rather than a circumstance I'd fallen into." She looked at him a long time, gold eyes steady in the cockpit's low light, the familiar and beloved steadiness of someone who didn't waste assessments on things that didn't earn them. "What about the retirement?" she asked. "Turns out I'm not done," he said. "Turns out there's a thing worth working for that I haven't finished working toward yet." She reached over, took his hand, and held it the way her mother had once held something she'd built, and was trying to keep from the dark. "We're going to need a better ship," she said finally. "The Duskrunner is too small for what comes next. We'll find one. Something fast, though. Always." The months that followed were not simple. They were not supposed to be. They were the specific, demanding, occasionally dangerous complexity of rebuilding something from scattered fragments, finding the Vulpine survivors through the quiet relay network the Queen had established, gathering them toward a new center of gravity that didn't yet have a name or a fixed location but had a direction and two people committed to sustaining it. The Empire's attention eventually moved. Not because it stopped caring. Imperial strategic interests didn't expire, and the fleet had achieved its nominal purpose by taking the palace and its more visible assets, but because the thing it had been sent to acquire, the Archives Corps, had already gone. And the diplomatic fallout from a public occupation of a sovereign frontier system made a prolonged engagement expensive in ways that Imperial political calculation eventually found inconvenient. They withdrew with what they had, which was considerably less than what they'd come for, and the Queen's prison, by careful accounts received through the relay network, remained comfortable in the way that politically inconvenient prisoners were kept comfortable by administrations that had no desire to create any further inconvenience than already existed. Sarah received an encrypted message through the network on the day the fleet withdrew. 2 words, no signature, but the encryption key was one that no one else had ever possessed. "Build well." She read it once, showed it to Elias, and put it in the archive's oldest file, not the genetic records, not the pre-war documentation, but the file she'd started herself from the day they'd landed on the dead moon, the record of what came after, the account that no traveler's log or researcher's report had managed to capture yet because it was still in progress. They found a world, eventually. Green and unhurried, at the edge of a system too quiet to attract strategic interest, and rich enough in its ordinary resources to sustain a growing community without extraordinary effort. Not a kingdom, not yet, not in any formal sense, and Sarah resisted the framing deliberately, because kingdoms were built around thrones and what she was trying to build was built around people, which was a different architecture entirely, and one she was inventing as she went. The first community center went up in the 3rd month, a structure that managed to look both permanent and welcoming, which Sarah said was the most important design requirement, and the hardest to achieve simultaneously. Elias, who had built very little in his career and discovered in the building of this that he liked it considerably more than he'd expected, contributed primarily by lifting things and making structural observations that were roughly half instinct and half things he'd retained from reading the engineering assessments of every facility he'd ever been tasked to infiltrate. "You missed a career," Sarah told him, watching him examine a load-bearing question with the same focused attention he gave to everything that needed solving. "Multiple, probably. The mercenary one seemed most immediately available. And now? Now I'm apparently in the community infrastructure business, which I understand pays considerably less but comes with better colleagues." She smiled at him, the full version, unguarded and warm, the smile that had been something she'd carried internally for years and had finally been given the space to exist on the outside, and he felt, as he felt every time he saw it, still, even months in, the particular, irreversible thing that had happened to his professional architecture since the night he'd walked into the most important mistake of his career and found it turning into the best decision he'd ever made. "Come look at the relay room," she said. "I want your opinion on the signal configuration. I'm not a signals expert." "No, but you're the person whose opinion I want anyway." He followed her through the half-built corridors of the community's first permanent structure, into a room that smelled of new construction and the particular, promising smell of functional technology being installed by people who understood what they were installing it for, and stood beside her while she walked him through the relay configuration with the same precise, unself-conscious intelligence she brought to everything, and thought, not for the first time, that whatever this was, community, haven, the beginning of something that didn't yet have a name, it was the thing he'd been pointing himself towards since before he'd known it existed. He still carried the old habits. He catalogued exits. He ran security assessments. He maintained the Duskrunner with a care that went beyond practicality, because some old disciplines survived the change of context better than others. But underneath the habits, something had shifted. The fundamental posture of a man who'd spent 7 years standing with his back to the wall, and was slowly, carefully, learning what it felt like to turn around and face the room instead. A year after the fleet's withdrawal, Sarah received a longer message through the relay. The Queen's handwriting, she wrote by hand still, a deliberate archaism that she'd always claimed kept thinking honest, covered 6 pages of closely written text delivered through 3 separate relay nodes, each passing it forward through the network like something being kept alive by a chain of careful hands. She was, the letter said, being held under what the Empire called protective custody and what the Queen described as unnecessarily comfortable captivity, though I won't complain about the bed, which is excellent. There were diplomatic complications surrounding her imprisonment that worked in her favor. Enough frontier worlds had registered formal objections that the Empire was finding its political cost higher than expected, and there were conversations, the letter hinted, at levels of governance that the Empire preferred to conduct quietly, suggesting that the math of her continued captivity was shifting in a direction that Imperial pragmatism might eventually find inconvenient. The archive is the important thing, she wrote near the letter's end. The throne is the important thing only if it serves the people, and the people are the important thing always. I did not send you away to preserve a title. I sent you away to ensure that whatever comes next has you in it. Build what you are building. I will find my way out of here in my own time, in my own way. You know, by now, that I am not someone who wastes resources, and I have considerably more time than I usually do, and nothing to do with it but think and plan. The Empire should be worried about how much planning a captive queen is capable of. Sarah read the letter to Elias in the community's main hall, surrounded by the quiet evening activity of a growing settlement finding its rhythm, and at the end of the reading she folded the pages with the same precise, deliberate hand she used for everything and sat for a moment with them held between her palms. She's going to be all right, Elias said. Not reassurance. Observation, the assessment of someone who'd studied Reina Salvain across 2 months in her palace and understood what she was made of. She's going to be insufferable, Sarah said, and the smile broke through the worry like light through amber, warm and entirely her. She's going to walk out of whatever cell they're keeping her in with 6 months of plans and the absolute certainty that everyone else has been doing things wrong in her absence. Sounds like someone I know. She looked at him sideways. I am nothing like my mother. You are exactly like your mother in every way that matters and entirely yourself in every other way, and both things are completely true simultaneously. She was quiet a moment. Then, that might be the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation for professional detachment to maintain. The community took a name in its 2nd year, chosen by the assembled residents in the particular, messy, argumentative way that names chosen by communities rather than crowned by authority tended to be chosen. 3 candidates, weeks of discussion, a final vote that was closer than anyone had expected and produced a result that, looking at it afterward, seemed so obvious that everyone was mildly embarrassed about the closeness of the vote. Driftwood. A frontier word for things that survived the crossing and washed up somewhere unexpected to build something new. Elias contributed the name, and then denied it for 2 weeks before Sarah presented evidence to the assembled community, and he accepted the credit with the good grace of a man who'd been caught doing something quietly decent. The community found this funny. He found the community's finding it funny somewhat less funny, and then conceded, eventually, that it was probably funny, and let it be. The Dusk Runner still flew, still fast, still registered under a profile that needed updating now that Elias Voss had accumulated a slightly different kind of record over the past year. Not the 7 years' worth of completed contracts and professional efficiency that had caught the Coalition's attention, but a newer record, harder to quantify and considerably harder to damage, built out of the things he'd done since walking away from the last contract and toward the one that mattered. He flew supply runs. He flew courier work for the relay network. He flew, on 2 occasions, the specific kind of quiet, fast, careful mission that required old skills applied to new purposes. protecting newly arriving community members from the residual Imperial interest that hadn't entirely evaporated. Navigating past old bounty hunters who'd been pointed at Driftwood's general direction by people who didn't yet understand that pointing bounty hunters at a fully operational community with a former top-tier mercenary as its head of security was not the tactical masterstroke it seemed from a distance. He was good at the work. He was, if he was honest, better at it than he'd been at the previous 7 years' worth, because the difference between working for something and working towards something was the difference between a job and a reason. And reasons made people sharp in ways that jobs could never quite manage on their own. He asked Sarah to marry him on the Dusk Runner, because it seemed right, the first place they'd stood together in open space, the place where she'd pressed her hand against the viewport, and said it's bigger, and the whole shape of everything that followed had settled into its permanent form. He'd thought about it in advance. He thought about most things in advance, it was the habit of a careful man. And had still managed to do it badly, which was apparently what happened when a person who'd spent 7 years never once being taken by surprise was finally caught off guard by their own feelings in real time. She said yes before he'd finished the question, which told him she'd thought about it more clearly than he had, and then she pointed out 3 things about the proposal's execution that were objectively improvable, which told him the rest of what he needed to know about how the rest of his life was going to feel. Like the best possible version of being argued with. Like being corrected by someone who paid close enough attention to know where you were wrong and cared enough to say so. Like the specific, irreplaceable thing that happened when you stopped running and found, in the stopping, that what you'd run toward was better than anything you'd been running toward on purpose. The Driftwood community marked the occasion with a celebration that was louder than anything the settlement had yet managed, and the noise of it carried across the community's lights into the clear night sky above a world that hadn't existed in either of their plans not so long ago, and in the morning there was work to do, as there always was, as there always would be. The archive to protect, the people to serve, the relay network to maintain, the galaxy beyond the community's borders to navigate on behalf of everything they built inside them. The Queen walked out of Imperial custody 14 months after the fleet's withdrawal. She did it, characteristically, in a way nobody had expected and the Empire found simultaneously impossible to prevent and diplomatically impossible to punish. A legal challenge, filed through 3 different frontier world court systems simultaneously, arguing that the terms of her captivity violated no fewer than 7 separate provisions of the Intersystem's diplomatic charter that the Empire itself had signed and had no graceful mechanism for formally abandoning. The case took 8 months to work through the relevant courts. She won all 3. She arrived at Driftwood on a cold morning, traveling alone in a ship she'd apparently acquired through means she declined to specify, dressed not in royal regalia but in clothes that looked remarkably like practical travel wear, the silver in her fur more pronounced than when Elias had last seen her, and her gold eyes carrying the particular settled quality of someone who'd spent 14 months thinking and had arrived at exactly the conclusions she'd spent those 14 months working toward. Sarah met her at the landing pad. Elias stood a respectful distance back, giving the moment its due, watching the Queen and the Princess. The Queen and his wife, the 2 most capable people he'd ever known and, in aggregate, significantly more than his own considerable competence could easily contend with, hold each other in the morning light of a world that hadn't existed in anyone's plans until they'd collectively decided to build it. The community is good work, the Queen said, surveying the settlement's layout with the same assessing patience she brought to everything, missing nothing. Defensible perimeter, reasonable supply infrastructure, relay positioning is better than I expected. Who managed the security layout? Elias, Sarah said. The Queen looked at him across the landing pad with the same steady, weighing gaze she'd given him across the war room table 14 months ago, and then, for the first time since he'd known her, gave him something he hadn't seen from her before, a smile. Not an almost smile, not a ghost of one, but a real and complete and entirely unguarded expression of a woman who'd decided she was going to allow herself, just this once, to be satisfied by how things had turned out. Well, she said. You kept the contract. Yes, ma'am, he said. I tend to do that. She nodded once, the settlement, and the people moving through it, and the life taking shape inside it, in her assessment, and apparently judged sufficient. Good, she said. There's still a great deal of work to do. There always is, Elias said. That's what makes it worth doing. She walked into the community with Sarah at her side, the two of them already deep in the kind of conversation that was going to take weeks to fully unspool, and Elias stood on the landing pad for a moment, hands in his pockets, watching them go, the queen and the woman who'd chosen to be both princess and architect of something new. Walking together into the settlement they'd built out of stolen time and sacrifice and stubbornness, and an archive of everything a people had ever been. He would follow in a minute. He always did. First, he gave himself the particular quiet of a careful man who'd found the thing he'd been working toward and wanted to stand in it for just a moment before the next piece of work began. The open morning sky above Driftwood, the community waking into its day around him, the galaxy beyond the perimeter exactly as wide and loud and alive as he'd described it to a woman who'd only read about it in logs. And no longer just his to navigate alone. He took a breath. Tipped his hat, an old habit, from a very long time ago, the gesture of a frontier world he'd grown up in and never quite shaken loose, and nothing in particular, and everything in general. Then he walked in after them. The end.